Hi, thanks so much for having me. First, I want to begin by just saying how incredibly honored I am to be included in this program at all. I mean, some of the folks who've been on here, the contributions to American civic life has it's been they've had overwhelmingly positive contributions to American civic life, and so I'm just happy to be here to share with you a few pretty simple thoughts after reflecting on the morning that we've enjoyed together and morning and early afternoon that we've enjoyed together. First, I want to talk about um, I'm going to talk about three things very quickly. One is I'm going to talk about the silent demand for quality civics education. And when I say silent, I don't mean entirely silent. I mean relatively silent compared to the angry and loudest voices of American partisan politics. Then I'm going to talk about the low bar that we have to overcome for true civic education. And then I'm going to end with a call for leadership in this regard. So let's begin with what I call the silent demand. And that is one of the things that we have come to understand in American life is that most of American discourse is driven by a minority of Americans. So if you look at the More in Common project, and they have done an enormous amount of research on American polarization, and what they have found is that an enormous amount of our national discourse is driven by the people who inhabit their so-called wings, the people who are not just the most ideologically extreme. I mean, that's not exactly what the wings are, but the people who are most ideologically committed. And the people who are the most ideologically committed do tend to be a bit more extreme in many ways than some of their neighbors ideologically, but they're often more extreme in their temperament, in the way in which they interact with the public square, full of anger, full of negative partisanship. And these individuals who often dominate social media can completely drown out those folks who constitute what is called in the same literature and the same research the exhausted majority of Americans. And this exhausted majority of Americans share some things in common. And one of those things is not necessarily ideology. And this is about two-thirds of Americans. They're very fed up with the polarization in the United States. They feel forgotten in public discourse because they are often excluded from the conversation because they don't have the loudest voices. They're a little bit more flexible in many of their views, even though they might come from the left or the right. They're willing to compromise. And they also believe strongly in finding a common ground. And this group of people on the left and the right constitutes about two-thirds of Americans. And these individuals are very, and in my experience, both anecdotally and what the data says, these individuals are extremely committed to finding a different way and a different way of interacting in American politics. And but they're not as vocal. They're not as vocal. They feel excluded from the public square. The second thing I would say is that um, a lot of this polarization and a lot of this anger is being driven by and being fed by an awful lot of ignorance, a huge amount of ignorance. And so when we talk about civic education, um, I think one of the things that we have to understand as we enter into this space that we don't necessarily have to get people to understand all of the arguments of the Federalist Papers, where they can summarize, say, Federalist 10 or Federalist 65 or 51 off the top of their heads, or understand the complexities of the American system to be more informed participants in the American system. A lot of our civic education has to be very, very basic. A lot of people don't know the branches of the government. There was a time not too long ago. I don't know how many folks who are watching and listening right now remember the show American Idol. When American Idol, well, I think it's still on, but when it was the Goliath, when it was the most powerful thing in TV ratings, this was in the earlier 2000s. And during that time, there were far more people who could identify Randy Jackson as a judge on American Idol than could identify John Roberts as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. So we have an awful lot of ignorance. And so our civic education, in many ways, shouldn't necessarily be too ambitious. And I think sometimes it's the ambition of civic education that often activates the polarization of civic education. It's when we move beyond a lot of the basics and we start to get into the much more sophisticated and nuanced takes on American history that you really begin to motivate the partisans. So I think that one of the things we have to do is we have to understand we don't even have the basics yet covered with the American public, and a prioritization of just understanding the system of government that they have can equip people and often can inoculate people even against extremism and being less susceptible to extremism. For example, I'm very well remember the Tea Party revolution in 2010, and then follow up surges, for example, of Tea Party activism in 2014, and a lot of it was centered around Obamacare. And there were an awful lot of people who legitimately thought that if they elected a majority in the House or a majority in the Senate, that they could repeal Obamacare. They didn't know what a veto was. They had often never heard of a veto. And so the inability of Congress to do what they felt like they'd elected Congress to do was frustrating and radicalizing, when the reality was it never could have accomplished what they thought. And so therefore, this very idea that you have been deeply disappointed or let down by a government that you have voted for, when you have had a misunderstanding of civics itself when you walked into the ballot box, that's something that has concretely contributed to a lot of alienation. I just use an example on the right in Red America because that's where I live right now. Or there was a memorandum that was released yesterday and spread all over the online world of a 6-part plan to overturn the election. And again, this is again coming from the area of the country where I live in Red America, that basic knowledge of civics would allow someone to just laugh it out of the room. And so you have, on the one hand, you have a kind of a silent and you have a silent majority, to use that term, or an often exhausted majority, an intimidated majority of people who long to turn down the temperature, sort of a low bar of civics education that can help turn down the temperature and help reconnect Americans to their democratic traditions. So it seems as if you have the combination of demand and the potential supply to meet the demand that can really help at least get us through some of the worst manifestations and the most extreme manifestations of how public ignorance can combine with ideology to create instability. So it seems like that's right there. It's low-hanging fruit right there. But the problem is, to get there requires leadership. It requires leadership that's willing to take slings and arrows from polarized wings who want to weaponize virtually everything. It doesn't matter what it is, if it's a public health edict, or if it's a history lesson, or if it's a moment in Hollywood, or if it's a moment on television. Anything can be weaponized by hyperpolarized wings. And foremost among those things that can be weaponized is American history and civics. To teach American history and civics in a way that is designed from the ground up to essentially cause one side to win and another side to lose, rather than civics as an opportunity to educate all Americans so that we're participating in a democratic process, much more fully aware of what the process is capable of delivering, and just as importantly, what it is not capable of delivering. And in that circumstance, I think what you need to happen, what has to happen, is you have to have leaders who are willing to step forward on behalf of this exhausted majority, take the slings and arrows of the polarized wings, and persevere. And I think if you can do that, we can concretely cross, and we can substantially cross that low bar. The fact that there's a low bar, that's bad news. It means that we have so much ignorance. But the fact that it's a low bar means that you can also more easily cross it. It is not so difficult to teach people the basics of American democracy and the basic foundational principles of the American Republic. So do not weaponize, inform, lead, and be willing to take the slings and arrows, and have the relatively modest goals, and understand that even achieving those modest goals will be an extraordinary advance from where we are. And then understand, once we achieve those modest goals, that's the end of the beginning of the quest to restore American democracy, to preserve an American republic. I should say, preserve American democracy, preserve the American republic, and begin to turn down the temperature so that American citizens can understand that compromise and communication is the lifeblood of our republic, not victory and domination of hated political opponents. Thank you all very much.